XTC burst out of late 70s Britain with hooks for days, while many of the punk bands around them proudly ignored anything before 1976. They took notes from the Beatles, Kinks and Beach Boys, and reformed them into pugnacious, state-of-the-art pop. Making Plans for Nigel, Generals and Majors, and Senses Working Overtime made their unique stamp on the UK charts. But when XTC stopped playing live in 1982, their career took a much more interesting turn. Unable to sell their Englishness to the British, instead via calamitous recording sessions with Todd Rundgren and a dismissed B-side, XTC landed a punch squarely below the Bible Belt. This is New British Canon, and this is the story of Dear God.
Yes.
Andy Partridge grew up in Swindon, 80 miles to the west of London. Industrially important, but culturally isolated. Enduring a difficult childhood, he occupied himself with various solo creative endeavours, but his musical salvation came in the form of an American prefab pop group.
Hey, hey, we're the Monkees, and people say we monkey around.
The Monkees helped launch me into this insane career. They caught me at just the right time. I watched the TV show every week. I thought, this is what groups do. They all live in the same house, go on wacky adventures, and girls fling themselves at them. This is the job for me. It was like career guidance. His musical loves would soon extend beyond bubblegum to early psychedelia.
Going to strawberry fields. The Everly Play. White bicycle.
By the time he formed Helium Kids in 1973, he'd absorbed everything from jazz fusion to proto-punk, being especially taken with the New York Dolls. Helium Kids would later rebrand themselves as XTC, amongst the first rumblings of British punk, a form that Partridge was unimpressed by. This was 77. I walked into this HMV and waited 10 minutes or so, and in rotation, Anarchy in the UK came on, and I thought, is that it? Is that what all the fuss is about? It just sounds like a slower version of the Ramones, or the Monkees with a bit more fuzz. I don't know, it just wasn't new enough, you know? That this, in his approximation, rather average music, was being lauded, motivated him forward in his songwriting. The band now consisted of himself on guitar and vocals, Colin Moulding on bass and vocals, Terry Chambers on drums, and Barry Andrews on keyboards. By the end of 1977, XTC had ticked off a laundry list of pivotal band events. They'd been signed to Virgin Records. They'd had their first Peel session in June.
She's a square. She's not wired.
Released their first EP in October.
Science friction that burns my fingers.
And recorded their debut album, White Music.
And all the kids are complaining that there's nowhere to go.
Early singles were written by Partridge, chunks of his oddball personality reconstructed into forceful, if wonky, pop nuggets. The hiccuping rush of Science Friction, lead track from the 3D EP, not only touches on his childhood astrophobia, but also the comic book worlds he would escape into. The whooping scar-flecked Statue of Liberty is a more traditional love song.
You've been the subject of so many dreams since I climbed your torso.
But makes the mostly flattering comparison between his girlfriend and a very special woman who is 100 years old and weighs over 200 tons.
This enormous woman will devour us all! Ah!
I meant the statue.
My Statue of Liberty.
The BBC would ban the song due to the line,
And in my fantasy I'll sail beneath your skirt.
though they were compared to other bands of the time.
And they're very
cool for cats, they're cool for cats.
Think of a number, don't get swept under. A number's a number.
Partridge's knack for reassembling his varied reference points was what made XTC stand out. It's just music. It's taking apart what you've already got and making something different. You build up a song, you've got lots and lots of bits and pieces, influences from people in the band, and it's sort of like a construction set. So what you do is loosen all the nuts and bolts, take some of the pieces away, and you're left with an interesting skeleton. None of the singles from the first two albums made the UK charts, but the music press felt that with their unique sound, it was just a matter of time before XTC were household names. Journalists were also applying terms like herky-jerky, angular, and clever to their music, while trying their best to pigeonhole them within punk, post-punk, or new wave. Partridge was particularly rattled by this.
What do you call that noise that you belong?
Like the Monkees, Beatles, and Pistols before them, it was still just pop music. Single This Is Pop deals with this head on.
This is pop. Yeah, this is pop.
Pop is such a dirty word. We wanted to be a pop group right from the start. We just wanted to be popular. We wanted our faces to be known, our personalities to be known, comics to be written about us, dolls to be made after us. I wanted to make films, all very corny. Partridge wasn't the only songwriter in XTC. Colin Moulding had 3 of his own songs and white music. But when keyboardist Barry Andrews started wanting his songs to appear on second LP, Go To, there was conflict. While Moulding's songs mostly stuck to the template Partridge had solidified, Andrews' songs didn't fit. It didn't help that Partridge and Andrews were constantly sniping at each other. Even though the sound of his toy organ had defined XTC up to this point, he was given the boot, and in his place, guitarist and childhood friend Dave Gregory. I thought with the band almost killed off, we're gonna have to rise from the ashes. Dave Gregory being invited in was like us saying, let's start again. We just knew him, and we knew he played his instrument very well, and we needed somebody quickly who could competently carry a musical load, touring-wise. It was a sort of panic buy that we thought would have a guarantee to it, and I was relieved he didn't write. But it wouldn't be long before Andy Partridge realised that Barry Andrews wasn't his real competition for chart glory. In April 1979, XTC released their first single written by Colin Moulding, the nostalgic rock and roll bop, Life Begins at the Hop.
Come with me to the church on the corner of the hop.
It was also their first single to make its way into the UK Top 60, their number 54 placing being congratulated with an appearance on Top of the Pops. Though it would soon leave the chart, it made Virgin Records believe that Moulding, and not Partridge, was XTC's resident hitmaker. Less confident in his songs, Moulding's more traditional frontman visage had been hidden in Partridge's shadow. So when the band decamped to Townhouse Studios to work on their third album, Drums and Wires, and he appeared with a handful of chords and the key phrase, "We're only making plans for Nigel," Virgin was excited for its hit potential.
We're only making plans for Nigel.
It was like what George Harrison said. John and Paul were able to get their rubbishy songs out of the way before the Beatles became famous, whereas I had to do it in the public eye. On some of my early stuff I was aping Andy a bit too much. This was me trying to write something more me. Making Plans for Nigel has an autobiographical edge. Like in the song, the suggestible Moulding had for the longest time been moulded by his parents.
We only want what's best for him.
However, they were pushing him towards university, not a career in British Steel.
He has a future in British Steel.
Moulding instead chose rock and roll, but the character of Nigel was informed by those school days, a generation where children were supposed to be seen, but not heard.
Nigel is not outspoken, but he likes to speak and he loves to be.
Nigel sprang from my subconscious for no reason other than the fact that I knew a few boys at school called Nigel, and they all seemed to be rather put upon. Nigel is the sort of guy who stays with his mum till his 40s and keeps pornographic magazines under the floorboards. At Townhouse Studios, they were joined by producer Steve Lillywhite, the band having been impressed by his work with Ultravox, as well as Susie and the Banshees' The Scream. XTC were particularly interested in the powerful way he recorded drums, with his engineering partner Hugh Padgham, and Making Plans for Nigel has some seriously interesting drums. When I first heard the song, I just kept time on the drums, but started thinking, how could I make this more interesting? Because of the subject matter, I wanted to make the beat a bit more industrial, so instead of keeping the rhythm on the hi-hat, I played it on the floor tom, and used the hi-hat for the accents. It was the opposite to what drummers usually do, but it gave it a juddering, production line feel. The echoey reverbiness of the production was Partridge's idea, inspired by glam rock poster boy David Essex's dub-drenched 1973 single, Rock On.
Rock on, rock on. Still, yeah.
He put a further stamp of ownership on Moulding's song, with some unmistakable backing vocals.
We're only making plans for Nigel.
Literally, as soon as it came up, it was like, Jesus, this is annoying. But then again, that might be a good thing. That might click with people if they find it as irritating as I do. It was just a little badoop, sung in a falsetto. We still love those high falsetto Beach Boys-y answer things. I still love it. I mean, every time I hear Ça plane pour moi by Plastic Bertrand, I think, Jesus, why wasn't that me? Having been the de facto leader of the band up to this point, Partridge felt slightly put out by everyone clamouring over Moulding's newfound glory. The fact that Making Plans for Nigel, when it was released in September 1979, was the band's first top 20 single,
We're only making plans for Nigel.
and their only song to get significant airplay, stung all the more. I was incredibly jealous that everything Colin did was getting all their attention. He was the handsome sod, and I was the egghead. You could see Virgin's reasoning. He looked like a cross between Chrissy Hind and Nureyev. The thing that really annoyed me was that once they had decided this was the single, they devoted about a third of the studio time for the whole album to this. In January 1980, as an early indication of Margaret Thatcher's 80s, British steelworkers went on strike. But when their union contacted Moulding to get a quote off him about their current plight, he had no insight. The Steelworkers Union were very excited by what they saw as a fraternal anthem, but once I told the official that Nigel was from the management side, it curtailed the conversation.
Nigel's whole future is as good as sealed.
Meanwhile, I put the wind up British Steel with the song's suggestion that a future in the industry wasn't all that fantastic. They rounded up lots of Sheffield steelworkers called Nigel to tell the press how great their jobs were.
If young Nigel says he's happy, he must be happy, he must be happy.
In the wake of Nigel's success, Andy Partridge wanted to get back on top of Virgin's good graces, so put all his energy into the dubby follow-up, Wait Till Your Boat Goes Down. But it sank without a trace. Yet another non-charting single. But their fourth album, Black Sea, from September 1980, would produce 3 top 40 hits, leading with the Moulding-penned Generals and Majors,
Calling generals and majors.
it was the Kinks-esque Towers of London,
Towers of London, when they
and comic book fantasy, Sergeant Rock is Going to Help Me.
I could only be tough like him, then I could win my own.
That finally got Partridge's peculiar slant onto the charts, the latter surpassing Nigel by a single place.
Sergeant Rock is going to help me make the groove right.
In between albums, XTC had been touring the world non-stop. A confident, energetic live presence, they had managed to secure high-profile support slots with Talking Heads, The Cars, and The Police, Sting's crew being distinctly smitten by the Swindon mob. But being away from home, living out of suitcases, and spending most of their time in a cramped van was crushing their spirit. And it wasn't just the usual exhaustion. Partridge was suffering through Valium withdrawal. He'd been taking the drug multiple times a day since he was 12, prescribed for his hyperactivity, now known as ADHD. In an ill-advised move to help him quit, Partridge's wife had flushed all his medication down the toilet. When I calmed down, I thought, no, she's probably right. I don't need those things. They don't do anything for me. What do? Nothing. I don't need them. I'm going to be fine. It's going to be great. The lead single from their fifth album, 1982's double LP, English Settlement, would portend what was going on inside Partridge's head. In an attempt to write something brashly commercial and catchy, he formulated the chorus around an inverse of Manfred Mann's theme from Ready Steady Go, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Senses working overtime.
Counting to 5 resulted in a song about the 5 senses, which for Partridge was shorting out due to abrupt overexposure.
Trying to take this all in. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
The twitchy chorus was offset by the pastoral stillness of the verses. A peasant hard-working the fields, unaware of modern living's sensory overload.
The stroll for the donkeys and the innocents can all sleep safely.
Dave Gregory heard the song's themes as a reworking of the Beatles' It's All Too Much. Maybe if it had the directness of a Help, Partridge's bandmates may have clocked his distress.
I need somebody help, not just anybody help.
Senses Working Overtime ended up being XTC's highest charting single in the UK, peaking at number 10.
Time to taste the difference between the lemon and the lime. Pain and pleasure.
But they would not be able to properly monopolise on its success. Though Partridge protested to Virgin that he wasn't well enough to tour, XTC was sent out on the road again. In March 1982, 10 shows into their European tour, Partridge collapsed on stage after playing opener Respectable Street. The blackout was deemed to be the result of not eating for 3 days, presumably triggered by withdrawal. But less than a month later, XTC marched on, starting their first significant US headline tour. They played one uneasy show in San Diego. The next night, a sold-out show at the Hollywood Palladium, Partridge suffered a nervous breakdown and was physically unable to take the stage. My body and brain said, "You're hating this experience. I'm going to make it bad for you. When you go on stage, I'm going to give you panic attacks, stomach cramps. I'm going to mess it up for you. You're not enjoying this, and you haven't got the heart to tell anyone you can't carry on. So I'm going to mess you up." Fearing repercussions from promoters for cancelling their entire US tour, they spirited Partridge back to Swindon, accruing a massive debt in the process. XTC never toured again. After the aborted English Settlement tour, like their heroes the Beatles before them, XTC became a studio-based endeavour. However, when the Beatles dropped out to create more psychedelic, impossible to recreate live constructions, like Strawberry Fields Forever or Sgt. Pepper's, they were the biggest band in the world. XTC were a band that managed to secure a single top 10 hit, and were currently avalanched with debt. So as wondrously pop-literate and expertly crafted as 1983's Mama and 1984's The Big Express were, due to a lack of promotion, they didn't sell particularly well. Love on a Farm Boy's Wages from the former explains in somewhat abstract terms the financial pinch the band were feeling, exacerbated by suing their manager for unpaid royalties.
How can we feed love on a farm boys? Wages!
In addition to this, during the Mama sessions, feeling he was no longer needed, Terry Chambers quit. A fleeting, if confusing, silver lining was the Dukes of Stratosphere, a psychedelia-focused side endeavour of Partridge's invention. The rules of the project were simple: write and record like it was 1967, 2 takes at most, and to use period equipment if possible. After 2 weeks and £5,000 investment, they ended up with 6 tracks that varyingly pastiched LSD-era Beatles, Pink Floyd, and the Electric Prunes.
Then came the dawn, and you were gone. 25 o'clock, that's when you're going to be mine.
The most fun we ever had in the studio was recording the Dukes records. There was no pressure. It was just one big fancy dress ball for the head. Anything went, any sound, any idea, as long as it felt like it could have been historically correct for 1967. There was zero pressure. We never knew if it would sell, and the Dukes had nothing to live up to.
I'm the moon from the ministry.
Virgin released the songs as the 25 o'clock 12-inch on April Fool's Day 1985, marketed as an unearthed classic, and it quickly sold double what the last XTC album had. However, the project's teacup Englishness and kaleidoscopic miasma would spill over into XTC's next album, 1986's Skylarking. With sales being very bad in the UK and still not making a dent in the US, their label felt that XTC's overall sound was alienatingly English. So if they wanted to remain on the label, they would have to team up with a US producer with a proven track record of delivering hit albums. Todd Rundgren was the only one that Partridge recognised. Dave Gregory was a fan, and convinced Partridge by reminding him that he'd produced the first and best New York Dolls LP. Rundgren too had been a fan of XTC's work. After sending him 20 demos, Rundgren pared them down and assembled them into a track listing of his own devising, based around the concept of a lifetime in a day. It starts with the womb-set comfort of Summer's Cauldron,
Please don't pull me out. This is how I would want to go.
and ended with the finality of Dying and Sacrificial Bonfire.
And I'm getting older too. Sacrificial bonfire must burn.
In Between is a love story, flitting between infatuation, humiliation, heartbreak, and marriage, rendered in achingly serene pagan folk and the purplest art pop. The fact that this was worked out before the band had recorded a single note put Partridge at odds with Rundgren for the rest of the process. Andy didn't like being led. Todd chose the songs. I know for a fact that, had he not, my contribution in number would have been decidedly less. I was just grateful that the band had an independent arbiter. Now I know how George Harrison felt. Moulding would end up with 5 songs on Skylarking, more than any album before or after. Prior to the Skylarking sessions, Partridge had been in charge, the undisputed chief maker of creative decisions, with producers like John Leckie and Steve Lillywhite rarely interfering with the songcraft. But Rundgren was there because Partridge's prior methods had not worked commercially, to dissuade him from some of his worst impulses from their last couple of records.
For XTC, what would happen is like all of the air would go out of the mixes because Andy would find some little space he wanted to fill it in, you know, so he would like make something brighter or louder or whatever, so that it was kind of like it was losing its dynamics. It's just like a thing that comes at you.
As the two big personalities collided, Rundgren took control, openly ridiculing Partridge for his lyrics, singing, and even his trousers. Only one person there had recorded the multi-million selling Bat of Hell, and it wasn't Andy. Todd's way of working was to be dominant in all matters. As long as you lay down on your back while he puts his foot on your stomach, you'll get along just fine. If you had the temerity to argue with him, he'd just go home and tell you to dick around with it on your own until it doesn't work your way, and then I'll come back and we'll do it my way. Partridge would get his own back in ineffectual ways, leading the band to play through the Munsters theme tune as Rundgren entered the studio. Rundgren, unaware of his own supposed physical likeness to the looming, monstrous Herman Munster, feeling powerless to create his art the way he wanted, Partridge directed his impotent rage towards his longtime ally, berating Moulding's bass line on Earn Enough for Us.
I can take humiliation and hurtful comments.
The resultant fight was the only really vocal disagreement the two had ever had in the history of the band. Mostly their grievances were aired under their breath, but this motivated Moulding to make an exit. I did a Ringo. Andy was not enjoying being dictated to, and I think he was taking it out on me a little. I was a little hyped and we were all homesick. At the time I said, I'm out, but this band is my life. Why would I want to leave it? I left and came back and it was never mentioned again. Despite everything, Skylarking is filled with moments of wonder, the lusty springtime fumbling of grass.
The way you slap my face just fills me with desire.
Dave Gregory's nimble solo on That's Really Super, Supergirl. The cinematic orchestration that flows through 1,000 Umbrellas.
How can you smile and forecast weather's getting better and you soon forget her if you...
And the fading memories of dying.
What sticks in my mind is the dewdrop hanging off your nose.
But that didn't mean it was an instant hit. Skylarking was released in October 1986, confirming Partridge's suspicions about Rundgren's interference. It flopped pretty hard. It would peak at number 90 on the UK album chart, before dropping out completely the next week. The first single, the Moulding composition Grass, also failed commercially. Meekly climbing to number 100 on the UK singles chart for 2 non-consecutive weeks. Things were not looking good for XTC in the UK, but over in the US, curious college radio DJs had imported Grass 7 inches and taken notice of the B-side.
Dear God, sorry to disturb you, but I feel...
If Skylarking was Partridge wrestling with the big chewy themes of life with his post-Valium clarity, Dear God was Partridge verbally fist-fighting with a deity that he didn't believe was there.
I can't believe in you.
Like many an Englishman raised by the church, Partridge had beef with Jehovah.
Did you make mankind
But unlike most, he claims to have seen the face of God.
after we made you?
I'd struggled with the concept of God and man and so on since I was a kid, even to the point where I got myself so worked up with worry about religion that, around the age of 7 or 8 on a summer's day, I saw the clouds part, and there was this sort of classic Renaissance picture of God, surrounded by his angels, looking at me scornfully.
Dear God, sorry to disturb you, but I feel that I should be heard loud and clear.
The title was taken from a series of books that were popular at the time, filled with children's letters to God. Partridge found the concept tacky, but the title and the idea of an atheist writing to the creator, questioning his presence, intrigued him.
All the people that you made in your image sit around fighting in the street.
For the song's countrified twang, Partridge again returned to a memory from his youth, him being goaded into continually playing a song by his own personal deities, the Beatles. Because I was the youngest, they'd physically lift me onto the desk, give me my guitar and say, "Play Rocky Raccoon, or you're not getting down." I'd play it over and over until the teacher came back.
And Rocky collapsed in the corner.
Feeling it complemented the concept, Rundgren suggested that the first verse be sung by a child, and arranged for a friend's 8-year-old daughter, Jasmine Vayette, to come into the studio to record. XTC were barred from the session, so she would be more comfortable singing Partridge's lyrics about skepticism, starvation, and the price of beer.
I don't mean a big reduction in the price of beer.
Because of the music video, many believed that a boy was singing, but no.
See them starving on their feet, 'cause they don't get enough to eat.
When it came to the final master of Skylarking, Virgin disliked the kid singing, and felt that this antagonistic song about the Almighty might offend Middle America. But mostly, Partridge felt he hadn't done the subject justice.
I won't believe in heaven, hell, no saints, no sinners, no devil as well.
It wasn't chewy enough. I only had 3 minutes to take on such a big subject. Don't get me started talking about religion.
The pearly gates, no thorny crown. You're always letting us humans down.
It plays on basic spinal column superstitions and fears, saying there's an aging English actor up here in a sheet, and he's gonna zap you with his rod if you don't put something in the collection plate and behave yourself.
The Father, Son, Holy Ghost. It just so is on the Holy Host.
God is man-made. We invented this to keep other members of mankind, and especially womankind, under control.
And if you're not there, you perceive that my heart's here upon received.
It's a protectionist racket. Humans can't live without magic. Gods, pop stars, clowns, UFOs.
There's one thing I don't believe in.
So when US college radio DJs started playing the B-side to Grass, XTC's US label, Geffen, was inundated with calls asking about this song that they knew nothing about. Such was the demand that Geffen immediately reissued the album with Mermaid Smiled, replaced by Dear God. But controversy hung over the song. In a move to get the song pulled from playlists, a Florida radio station got a bomb threat. Conversely, a New York State teenager held his school secretary at knife point, forcing her to play the song on repeat over the school's PA. So strongly had he connected with the song's message. Mail started to arrive, and it was 50%, "This is fantastic. You voiced what I've been thinking for years." And 50%, "You're gonna roast in hell." It really pissed off some people. But I'm glad it did. As a song though, I still think it's a petulant failure. Dear God made Skylarking their biggest album in the US to date, peaking at number 70 on the Billboard chart. Rundgren may have caused tension in the band, but he achieved exactly what the label wanted. 6 months after the LP's reissue, it outsold the rest of the XTC catalogue 3 times over. In the US, XTC would go on to greater success in the years that followed. College rock and alternative becoming such an undeniable sector of American rock radio that the modern rock chart became a thing in 1988, benefited XTC greatly. Their 2 follow-up albums, Oranges and Lemons in 1989 and None Such in 1992, would both birth a modern rock #1. But not owning any of their own recordings, and wanting to be finally free of Virgin, XTC went on strike, and didn't release any more music until they were freed from their contract. By the recording of 1999's Apple Venus Volume 1, Dave Gregory had had enough. It was getting very difficult to work with Dave, because there was no to everything. I had to say to him at one point, "Can you take a break? Because I want to do some vocals, and I can't do them with you just shaking your head all the time." That day he packed up all his gear and left the studio. Colin Moulding stuck it out for a while longer, submitting his regulation-free songs to 2000's Wasp Star, finally leaving Partridge to his own devices in 2006. The same year, a recording studio accident meant that a large amount of Partridge's hearing was destroyed, the ensuing tinnitus leaving him at the time suicidal. Still, he remains one of the great British songwriters, even if Britain at large didn't care for his eccentric, oh-so-English musings. I have a problem with that tag, to be honest. To me, eccentric means damaged, and thankfully I'm not Syd Barrett, and I'm definitely not Michael Jackson. If the songs mythologize Swindon, then that's fine, but I don't. I'm governed by my phobias and fears. And when you're like that, you're comforted by what you know. Influence-wise, XTC is surprisingly prevalent. Blur's first choice of producer for the Britpop urtext, Modern Life is Rubbish, was Andy Partridge. Though none of his work made the final album due to creative differences, XTC can still be heard in Blur's spiky character studies, with provoking backing vocals.
Looks at his watch, he's on time. Jason Jack, Chameleon, oh oh oh.
Also on the producer front, the Stone Roses teamed up with John Leckie on their epochal debut, thanks to his work with the Dukes of Stratosphere, while the new Enemy Revolution bands would also try to replicate their post-punk period. Their 80s power pop work would inspire those on the other side of the pond. Recently, Porcupine Tree's Steven Wilson, remixing the albums, has opened up the band to the proggier side of obscure music enjoyers. XTC being reassessed alongside ELO, Peter Gabriel and Kate Bush as purveyors of prog pop. But at large they are missing their running up that hill moment, an undeniable pop culture needle drop that would reintroduce the band to a new generation of fans. His face might not be known to the public at large. He never got comics written about him, or dolls in his image, and due to his issues playing live, he didn't have anywhere near the amount of wacky adventures he dreamt of as a kid. But Andy Partridge did briefly become part of the Monkees. In 2016, he crafted a couple of power pop confections for their revival album, Good Times.
Love's what I want for us all. When you come around, you bring the summer.
Andy Partridge still remains in his hometown of Swindon, constructing pop marvels from his garden shed studio, whether there's an audience or not. When Classic Rock magazine asked him what he was most proud of, he replied with characteristic bravado, writing songs as good as the Beatles, Kinks, Beach Boys, or any of the people I idolized as a youngster. I know people are going to be guffawing and clutching their sides, but despite coming from a poxy council estate in Swindon, I've written, and my bunch of lads have made, music as good as our heroes. Thanks for watching. Do you think XTC are still underrated? Comment down below. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and why don't you also do me a favour and share it with a couple of people. It really does help. As always, I'd like to shout out my new top tier supporter over on Patreon, Matthew Lusich. And thanks again to all that support me. And I'll hopefully see you in 2 weeks for a key moment in the death of Britpop.